Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel, or welcome for the first time if you are new here. Today I am tickled and delighted and honored to be talking to the formidable Stephen Gibb of the Red Book. So if you would like to say hello, Stephen, or say anything about what your current projects are, former projects, why people might know you on the internet.
Yep, so glad to be here. I'm Stephen from the Red Book, and I've been on YouTube for about 4 years now. And if you don't know my channel and you know Lexi's, that's maybe a bit weird. I think we share a massive amount of the same viewer base. We have the same approach to videos that we make about Tolkien. So much like Lexi, I attempt to analyze Tolkien's Legendarium, try and go a bit deeper than just recapping stories, try to explore themes and actors and deeper meanings. And even though I've been away from YouTube for quite a few months, I'm actually working on a project just now focused on the Rings of Power, and that's Tolkien's Rings of Power, not the TV show. It's actually a 10-part series that I'm doing, and it's taking a very long time to write. I'm already behind schedule, but so that's what I'm currently working on, and I have plenty of videos on topics that should interest viewers of Girl Next Gondor channel. So if you haven't heard of me or my channel, please go and check it out, and you might find something you like.
Excellent, thank you. And yes, at least a 10-part series on the Rings of Power, I think, is urgently needed to sort of cleanse the internet. Um,
Yeah, I think it was a bit bold in writing all that out, and then it's got to part two, and oh, this is pretty daunting. I can't imagine how long it's going to take me to do. I'm very slow at this stuff, but hopefully, hopefully people like it when it's done.
yeah, I mean, I can't think of much that sounds better than just like many hours of we're going to talk about the Rings of Power and all the ins and outs of them. So, speaking of talking about all the ins and outs and spending hours, if you have watched my channel for a while or watched Steven's channel for a while, or both, as is very likely, you'll probably remember that something like 3 years ago, which sounds absurd, but I think it's accurate, we did a conversation on mostly on Morgoth and his character and his powers and so on and so forth, philosophical issues. And today, I guess we're sort of, this is almost a follow up, a part two, a reprise. Um, so if you have not seen that yet, you may want to go back or, go find it or go back and revisit it, because I think in that conversation we covered a lot of the kind of groundwork of the what texts we were referring to and kind of summarizing and explaining a lot of the situation. And I think this time we are going to be kind of going off of that, basing ourselves off of that as a reference point. So basically, if we start talking about things and you're very confused and you have no idea what we're talking about, um, you can check out multiple videos on Steven's channel. You can check out a few on my channel. You could probably just type into the Googles and see what they tell you about the topic. But you could also use that previous discussion as a starting point, too. I think that might be safe to say. So, to get started, I figure I will mention something that somebody referred me to a week ago, week and a half ago, and it's kind of been haunting me a little bit ever since, or I've been like noodling on it. And it's this idea that as goes Melkor, so too goes the rest of the legendarium in Tolkien's mind. The idea that the version of Morgoth we see in the later writings and things like Morgoth's Ring and Myths Transformed and all that sort of post Lord of the Rings material is a very different kind of character than the way he started out as, going all the way back to Book of Lost Tales, where he's kind of almost this mischief maker. He's malevolent, but he's not necessarily. You know, he's almost more of a Loki than he is, I guess, the devil.
Yep.
And that reflects a lot of Tolkien's changing ideas about the metaphysics of Middle Earth. So, yeah, I guess. What do you think that holds true, or do you think it's a good thing that that character changed the way he did, or do you think there's some problems introduced by it, or what's your thought?
Well, I think first of all, I think you're definitely right. I would say that he's a Loki figure in the early text for sure, and that's because in general, in the Book of Lost Tales and these early versions of the text, I think the whole scope of the Valar themselves are far closer to um, classic mythology than what the Legendarium actually became. And when I say classic mythology, I do mean classical and just what your general viewer or reader would see as your typical mythologies, your Norse mythologies, your Greek mythologies, your pantheons of gods or lowercase g gods, if you want to say that. And um, the Legendarium itself is far closer to these than the heavily Christian influenced one that it became later. And for Melkor, I have to just say that it was a good decision because what we've ended up with is what we know and love. And I enjoy Melkor as the primordial god-like figure that fell from the greatest heights, basically your Lucifer figure, fell from the greatest heights into the lowest lows and was the prime evil in the world, instead of another Loki, which all mythologies seem to have. And I would start to view Sauron more as the deceiver, the Loki mischief maker in a way, and Melkor in the later text, which means we still get that figure, we still get him in there somewhere, but Melkor becomes almost like a force of nature that is defeated before, well, long before the characters that we love in The Lord of the Rings, most of them, and from the view of the race of men, could understand. And that's something I really love in the text. So it's a good choice for me. And I think that, as I said, you're right, that in the early text, um, I've got examples that we could give, but I definitely viewed him when I was reading that text as this seems more like the prose Edda or the poetic Edda. These are like fables and folk stories where they overcome the bad guy with something that's almost quite funny how they've done it, or he's defeated them with it's more mischief than I'm going to uh, corrupt and conquer the earth itself. It just changes in seriousness and scope to me, and it makes it less like those mythologies that everyone else imitates. Tolkien forged something of his own. That's how I view that.
Yeah, we could, I think, get a little bit into on fairy stories, which I just
Mm.
kind of had to wrestle with all over again because I had to figure out if Tolkien had an actual definition of what he considered art and what he considered subcreation versus, I guess, the simulation of that. And I did not,
Yep.
unfortunately, come to, because it's Tolkien, he never actually, spelled it out neatly for me. He just sort of talked around it, and contradicted himself, or seemed to contradict himself 3 pages later. But one of the big famous things in On Fairy Stories is, of course, the idea that you pull out of the soup pot. That's the metaphor he uses. Is you've got kind of all these elements of different mythologies and legends all simmering away, kind of in the almost in the collective unconscious, and you sort of dip into that and pull out a combination of things. It's like, well, is any of the things original? No, but it's still a unique kind of bowl of soup because you never
Yeah.
know what combination of things you're going to get. And I think what you said about the Christian influenced idea, I guess traces of it are kind of all of the like people of the book religions going back almost to Zoroastrian, I guess, duality. The idea of the duality plus, the idea that there's a force of evil, I guess, for lack of a better word, opposing the force of good that's nearly coeval to it, along with the sort of pantheon of the more, I guess, I hesitate to say animistic, but almost more like nature personified, what you said, classical mythologies. And classical, I guess, we're talking like classical periods of civilizations, not just like Mediterranean. Some people have different definitions of classical, and I think they should broaden their definitions. So, one thing I noticed you said, though, is that you said that Morgoth was defeated before the characters on The Lord of the Rings kind of came online. And, I guess in one sense, yes, he was killed and put out of the world, but in another sense, this is the concept of Morgoth's ring. He does...
Fingers
he gets a last laugh in the end.
Yeah, that's... I think that's something else I find fascinating as well, that even these figures, when I say most, we're obviously discounting the likes of Galadriel and these figures who, or Gandalf, who would clearly know who and what Morgoth was, but just your typical man that exists in the Third Age or even into the Fourth Age doesn't really know or understand the concept of Morgoth, but he is, against his will, really influenced by him too. The evil is in the earth itself. And if it's in the earth itself, the physical earth is what actually creates the bodies of everyone who's living on that earth as well. It's almost like your original sin. You're tainted when you're born, and that's because of Morgoth. And I think the biggest, you said the last laugh. I agree and disagree with that, because he has corrupted everything to the point where to undo that corruption, you have to destroy creation, which is a massive victory in itself for Morgoth. But he doesn't get to enjoy that because he's outside of creation. If he's in the void, he's separated from it. He's separated from the effects of his influence, and I can't think of anything worse for a figure like Morgoth than to be separated from all the corruption and evil and all the influence that he's spread in the world. He can't feel that and enjoy it until we get to Dagorath, where apparently that evil finds its way back to him. His spirit kind of seeps its way to him in the void and gives him enough strength to escape. Which is interesting, but we're talking eons and eons of Morgoth not being able to enjoy the fruits of that labor, which I think would be torment for him. He's essentially in his own hell in the void because he's separated from what he's done, and these tyrants would loathe that, I think, if you agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's. I'm sure he is not having a great time out there. Seems to fit with his character, with his strong motivation to not only avoid. By the end of his, what I've been calling his career, by the end of the First Age, he's desperate to avoid physical death. He's very bound to his physical body in a way that is weird for Ainur. They don't, usually they view it as like a sweater. It's like, oh, you ripped my sweater. Oh, wah, I'll cry and go buy a new one. But he's desperate to remain not only within Arda, not just within Ea, not just within Arda, but within the current form that he has assumed. So he has really gotten bound up and diminished. At least so say the other Valar, if you trust them. I trust them.
We can get to that, but
we can.
I don't know. I don't know if I covered this in the apologies to people viewing it. If I did cover this, it's something I have talked about where, when people ask this about Morgoth being bound to physical form, becoming one of the incarnates who he loathes, but these Dark Lords, through their evil deeds and their time spent in these forms, they have to, even though this is against his will, really, but they have to become a part of what they're trying to influence. And you have to think of physical bodies as being as much a part of Arda as a mountain range. It's physical matter of Arda. And Morgoth becomes a part of it. And as you said, he diminishes by the end of the first age physically. And this is what Tolkien calls the separation of Morgoth and the Morgoth. So the Morgoth is the black folk of the world, the dark folk of the world, the physical being that the Valar can now conquer physically and restrain. But Morgoth has now become Morgoth Ring, which is the unassailable force that has been placed into absolutely everything, well, most things, and that can't be defeated by conventional means. So he's got his victory in that sense, but he can now be physically defeated as he is, and it's up to us to kind of determine how he would view that. He'd obviously want both. He'd want to reign as king while corrupting everything, but in performing what he's wanted with the Morgoth Ring, he's now opened himself up for that defeat, which he does suffer, and he becomes sort of a pathetic life form by the end, despite this immense power that's been placed into the world. It's no longer his, so to speak, that he can wield some sort of weapon.
Yeah, we talk about this phrase Morgoth's ring, which kind of refers to the separation you mentioned between Morgoth himself, sort of his personal being and power and agency, versus his dispersal of that into material Arda, to the point where it's basically it's in everything. It's in the very fabric, literally fabric of reality. And on the one hand, it means you can't get rid of it, but on the other hand, it means that Morgoth himself has kind of lost control over it. Not kind of, he has lost control over it. And that phrase, Morgoth's ring, that's Tolkien's phrase. So the reason, I think, the reason that he uses that as a metaphor, he says by the end of it, you could imagine all of Arda as being Morgoth's ring, is because he's referencing Sauron in the ring, the actual ring that Sauron made through an analogous but not identical process. And one of the things he says, I think this is the Waldman letter, but it might be one of the later ones, talking about Sauron and the ring, is that he links it back to the idea of the machine and technology. And, for Tolkien, the idea of technology and the machine with a big capital M, like, he's not just talking about, like, a water-powered mill grinding your grain, because the hobbits have that, like, that's fine. The elves have
Good
arguably...
uses of it. Yeah.
Huh?
There's like good uses of machinery. Otherwise, we'd just all be in caves being hunter-gatherers. So he's not meaning all technologies bad, like some people seem to think, like he's a Luddite or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, he may... I think...
Maybe.
I think in his better moments, Tolkien was able to distinguish between his personal sort of aesthetic distaste for things like cars, driving through his Oxford countryside, versus saying, like, the internal combustion engine is inherently evil, full stop. He's like, okay, there's a difference. There's machinery which has, potentially moral and ethical implications that need to be very carefully considered. And then related, but, a different kind of thing is, I simply don't like them, or I don't like them here,
Yeah.
But I mean, when he's talking about the machine, one of the things that he's talking about, and the ring is an example, I think, for Tolkien, of the machine, even though it's literally, it's just like it's jewelry, to look at it. but he says the point of it is you gain, I guess, sort of short-term power by relinquishing a degree of control of it. And that's what he says happened with Sauron, and then decades down the line he's saying that's kind of similar to what happened to Morgoth, is that you can have the power be within yourself, and then that's great, but there's not all that much you can actually do with it to act on others and on the world. Versus the more you act on the world and the more you use kind of these machine devices to do so, these sort of shortcuts, it's kind of like using a lever in that it makes you more effective, at least in the short term, but there's a proportionate cost of your loss of control, direct control over it. So Sauron kind of avoids that by concentrating. Morgoth has the dispersal, which means that in order to really scrub every trace of him from reality, you have to actually unmake reality. So, I mean, in one case, that's a win, because his power will go on as long as existence goes on. But then it's also a loss, because even if Morgoth, not the Morgoth as in the substance, but Morgoth as in Melkor the person, even if he is not defeated, he's diminished. Even if he had survived somehow, he would still kind of just be shuffling around. You think you get the sense that he would sort of be in the bar drinking and being like, I was a god king once.
Well, that's the dispersion of the power into what Tolkien calls devices. So I think when you hear devices, it's usually Saruman, and people imagine the devices of Saruman being literal machinery or something, and it's like, it's not that. It's the power you're placing into things or people that are performing the tasks and achieving your goals. So Morgoth diminishes physically as a person, a being, but he's dispersed power into so much that he has armies of slaves and servants who do win the war in Middle-earth for him. It's not him out there bashing everyone with Grond and winning battles. He's long hidden himself from any sort of conflict that way. But his devices that he's placed his power in, and I don't mean, this is quite hard for people to get. Like, he's not putting his hand on an orc saying, I've given you power. It's just what he's performed over this time, placing it into the earth, his will into the earth. It's poisoned all these beings, and they all serve him, to their very core, and they are his devices, and they could win the wars for him. And this is what happens with all the evil beings. It's all their devices that diminish them as individual beings, but they've dispersed their power out into the world, and that is what's going to contain their, or they hope, for all time. But they can't have it both ways. So like you say, you can have your inherent spirit, your gifts, but if you want to control, like Morgoth originally did before he wanted to destroy, and Sauron did, you have to sacrifice in some way. There's not unlimited power, if we're calling it that. And Sauron isn't as great as Morgoth. He can't do a Morgoth's ring. He uses Morgoth's ring to help him with his ring. And it's almost like he's been very clever with, well, I've concentrated it into an actual object that I can wield for enhanced power. But it's his great undoing, because now you can completely defeat Sauron, unlike Morgoth. It's almost like he was too clever for his own good. He created something that really enhanced his power on Earth, but if someone else did get their hands on it and unmade it, he's screwed, basically, and that's exactly what happens. And that can't happen to Morgoth until the so-called second music of the Ainur.
Yeah, the Dagor Dagorath of questionable canonicity, depending on who you're asking. I think it's I think there's an endpoint baked into the idea of Middle Earth, particularly even if you're just focusing kind of on the Lord of the Rings era writings. There's this idea that it's the long defeat. That's what Elrond says. Is, why are we fighting the long defeat? Well, it's because ultimately, somehow, even though Frodo destroys the ring and Sauron is destroyed and Aragorn restores reunites the kingdoms and everything, everyone's like yay, and then within a generation people there are cults arising and Morgoth worship and the new shadow and all that. So well, what's the point of any of this? And it's like, well, the point is that at the end there is going to be some sort of conclusion that's going to take into account all of the striving beforehand, and that the world is decadent in the sense that there is that Morgoth element that's always going to, I think of it in terms of like almost like probability manipulation. There's this phrase in, I think it's the Annual Indole, could be the Valquenta, where they talk about who can imagine, who can fathom the thought of the Valar, because on the one hand they are towering, vast, primordial, I'm paraphrasing obviously, Tolkien did not say much less write it, but there's the vast elemental forces, just more giant than and more powerful than any of us can hope to comprehend. But at the same time, the other thing to think about is how precise they are, that they can come to a point as fine as, it's like if you compressed a giant mountain into the point of a needle, I think is the metaphor he uses, that they can see a lot about how time is going to play out because they remember to a greater or lesser extent. They have memories that extend before linear time, or at least that's the metaphor we're given to understand them by. And I think some of the stuff in Nature of Middle Earth talks about how mentally they can kind of fast forward the video and then kind of rewind. And I think that's kind of how I think about the Morgoth element, is that he's kind of given every dice roll an increased like 15% to, cause entropy and evil.
Yeah, because that's the reason that elves were always going to eventually fade, to allow men to dominate, but in a good way, just be the stewards of the earth. But Morgoth speeds it up to such an extent that he's poisoned the world, and the Valar start making mistakes, and this was all naturally meant to happen, and it just sped it up. But this is the complex part, it's all still part of the plan, because everything that happens gets incorporated into the plan. It's not that it was meant to be the plan all along, it's that you can't change or overrule the will of Eru. He's created these beings with free will as a path, but their free will can diverge it in certain ways, and it'll still reach final end. And that's what's frustrating for a being like Melkor. It's every single thing I do is apparently getting incorporated into an even greater good. It's almost as if the more he doesn't think he's evil, but the more I put my own influence into everything and basically corrupt it, it's almost like that will just mean there's an infinitely greater good that will come from it, because you can't start at such a good place and at the very end it's a good place as well. It's like you need that strife and change to have people grow and have just have challenges so that a greater good can come at the end. And I think this stuff's pretty tough for. I'm not saying I completely understand it, and no one say it's tough for people to grasp. It's the nature of the Valar's role in Middle Earth as well, because you said you were talking about their role, and you have to think as well that they're going to diminish, but in a natural way as well, not an unnatural way like Morgoth would, where eventually the Valar become impotent, really, because they have fulfilled their goal. They're following the true path of Eru to as much as they can understand, because he didn't reveal everything to them. But when they follow that path, as the world becomes even and steady over a great length of time, they're not really needed anymore. They don't have to be the governors. It's as this immortal world becomes mortal, essentially, the Valar become useless, but it's meant to be seen as something good. And Morgoth himself is a corruption of that very idea. That's why we come back to the whole fallen angels, Lucifer kind of thing. It's very reminiscent of that, as a lot of viewers will clearly know.
Yeah, I think it owes a lot to standard Christian and Catholic theological takes on Satan, but it's also, I think, Morgoth and a lot of most of the villains and slash anti-heroes in Tolkien have some element of very Miltonic Paradise Lost Satan as well, which
Yeah,
is very influential in terms of, I guess, the English literary imagination. Sort of Milton's like English language Odyssey, but he's gonna base it on Christianity. But it's also like he's basically like setting his little psychodrama soap opera within that framework, and I think that description of the Luciferian figure, the paragon always rebels and the paragon always falls. I think Milton is as influential as like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John
yeah.
in Tolkien's idea of how Morgoth works.
I think that brings it back to Paradise Lost. It's that influence brings all this closer to humanity and something we can feel the effects of these beings that we can't really comprehend. It's almost like Paradise Lost allows us a little glimpse into understanding it, understanding corruption and sin and everything, except for having to go back straight to a biblical source. It's almost like told to us as a story that we can we can comprehend, and that's where the Morgoth, like the fall of man with Morgoth, that's definitely one of Tolkien's uh, biggest links to Paradise Lost, where that's the whole point of what we're talking about here with Melkor changing over the course of the Legendarium from a Loki-like figure to a Lucifer figure. You don't get any closer to that than actually appearing before uh, beings created by God and corrupting them from the very start and having that influence be there until the very end. Having like that even ties it back into real world Christianity and everything like that as well. It's such a deep concept that's not really covered in a lot of the Tolkien discourse because it was left out of the Silmarillion probably, but um, I think that's one of the biggest changes where you had to have Melkor grow as a influential evil figure and not have it just be another god of a pantheon. It has to become the antagonist of the entire world and the created world. And I think the Fall of Man story really demonstrates that as well.
Yeah, I think I know before we started this, I mentioned that that was one of the things that we had not quite gotten into on our first go round talking about Morgoth. And I think we've kind of organically ended up there in a lot of ways. So good. The Fall of Man story in the Legendarium. Um, so this is I think a much later edition. This is kind of an idea that really got fleshed out post Lord of the Rings and even in some of the most final writings. Um, it's referenced in referenced in the Silmarillion when men arrive in Beleriand, and the Edain show up and the elves are all talking to him and everything, and they start talking about this shadow in their past that they've left behind and how they're trying to get away from the shadow, and they're trying to seek, this dim idea of true light and actual goodness, which they've been told is somewhere in the west. And then the elves kind of do a little bit more digging, put two and two together, depending on if you are going to go with the idea that the Athreth and related texts are reasonably accurate and not just Númenorian, basically the Númenorian Paradise Lost, which is an idea that Tolkien floated. But there's this story about how the fathers of the fathers of the fathers of men were, I guess, they awoke somewhere in the east. We're still not exactly sure. Somewhere in the Far East, canonically woke at the rising of the sun, although, of course, later Tolkien is like, I need to change this cosmology and screw with the timeline.
The big problem.
That's the big, this is the big logistical issue in making Morgoth the key figure, which is why I think sometimes he delegates it to Sauron. He suggests that Morgoth kind of told Sauron this would be a good idea, and then Sauron was the one to execute it. But in other versions, it's Morgoth himself, or it's presumed to be Morgoth himself, goes into the east at the awakening of men, finds them and corrupts them, and places some sort of shadow or darkness on their wills and on their hearts, which results in, among other things, a fear of death. It makes men, apparently, to the elves, noticeably more corruptible and prone to evil than even the elves are. So there's a way in which, yes, Morgoth's ring affects, material reality. It's in the very substance of Arda. The elves have to deal with it. The Valar have to contend with it. There's no escaping it. But then men, who, like you said, they're the ones who are supposed to inherit this project and kind of bring it to fulfillment. You talked about the Valar becoming powerless, but it being a good thing. It's like, yeah, because they're finishing the job that they were meant to be doing, which is, getting the earth going and bringing it to its fulfillment, becoming everything that it could be. And then men are supposed to be, somehow, and the elves don't get it, and they're kind of, one gets the sense they're kind of salty about it at this point. Somehow men are supposed to be the chief agents of this, and Morgoth makes a special point of especially corrupting men and the free will of men. At least that's how I read it. He has some sort of negative influence on the will of mankind that doesn't apply to just, everything's kind of more eviler and sadder because Morgoth exists and has made everything kind of suck, but then men in particular suck. So, I mean, that's one of the controversial things is, Finrod says this, I think, if it's true that Morgoth has the ability to affect the children of Eru on such an ontological level, then I think what Finrod says is like, well, we're all way more screwed than I thought we were, and I thought we were pretty screwed to begin with. So it is, even within the Legendarium, it's a controversial idea that he could do that. So are you pro?
I think, yeah, this is something that I would talk a lot about with Sauron, in terms of it's almost like a monkey's paw situation with Sauron. It's with the Rings of Power, for example, he promises or offers that certain gifts could be achieved, certain goals could be achieved if you do this, and the elves of their own free will do it, and they get to achieve what they wanted, what the Rings of Power actually do work, but Sauron gets to achieve his goals as well, which he just happened to keep secret. He's not really, well, depending on how far he stretches, he's not lied to them in terms of what he's offering them. He's just not painting the full picture for them. And I think this is what makes him so great and powerful. He does it with the Númenóreans as well. He tells them what they want to hear, and he allows these other figures to make their own mistakes, and then he takes advantage of it. And this is what happens with Morgoth. So you were saying there's potentially the idea that it was Sauron that was doing this, which I would accept as well, based on how he actually corrupts the race of men. This is something that I think Sauron could really do, but if it's Morgoth, that's fine. But he doesn't even really overrule the idea of free will, at least with these original men. It's he's offering them things, he's showing them things that lead them onto a dark path. And now that he's set them on that path, they are corrupted. I don't want to blame men for it, but it's because they could have had some sort of assistance, everyone usually says, but he's not using some power to overrule the natural order. He's using his power and abusing it to lead them to do it themselves. And how are they meant to act otherwise except out of just sheer blind faith? And that because they think that this figure that appears to them is Eru. That's the is how else are they meant to understand that this is the concepts beyond their understanding? So they fall almost through no fault of their own. And Eru's still quite angry with them because the voice does appear to them. Well, the voice appears in their heads again and says, "Oh, what have you done? That he's not who you think he is." But then Morgoth has already stained them, because he can then appear and say, "No, that voice is the darkness." You know, it's he's already got them by that time, and I think the idea that they could overrule free will only really becomes a problem if we're saying that each person born after that is drawn to evil in some way, which is what Morgoth's realm really is. This is where the idea of the path of Eru and faith would come into it, which Tolkien would also say is a good thing. You have to trust, hope, and good, and stay on that path. You can take the easy route, which would usually you take a darker path, but it's still your choice. You've got a choice in what you do, and there's just now this huge earthly influence that's going to try and corrupt you, and you have to try and not let it happen. But for these very early men, it's almost like they were powerless because they were so naive to what was going on in the whole world that this godlike figure appears to them and starts performing what we'd think of as magic and starts giving them what they want, you know, like things beyond their wildest dreams. But as he starts to get a hold of them, he starts taking from them and starts getting his way and starts getting worshipped. And by that time, it's too late. And just to finish this point off, they escape to the west, like you said. And what I find, it's a great moment, but it shows how dark all this is. They are escaping to the west into this light to escape the darkness. And when they get there, you realize that the enemy is already there. He's already fighting a war against elves. It's almost like they can't escape. So that's Tolkien has planted this seed of almost inescapable evil. Like you're if you give in and don't have any hope, it's completely understandable based on how great and evil this thing is. But that's the strength of keeping on to that hope. It's almost like in the darkest moments, that's when you're meant to have the faith and hope. And this is what Morgoth is going to force the race of men into confronting. And it's a very religious kind of concept, but I feel for the very first men because it's almost like they had to fall for the rest of this to actually take place. And any of them that didn't fall must have some fortitude and constitution to avoid that, because how would we react even now if some figure like that appeared for us? And these are naive men who have just awoken. It's what else were they meant to do? So it's quite a sad story, but it really shows that hugely corruptive influence of who we assume is Melkor.
Yeah.
Oh, shut up. So,
No, though that was all good. Yeah, a couple of thoughts I had when you said that they show up to, the first the Edain appear in Beleriand. They're fleeing this shadow in their past, which at this point, we have to imagine was generations that the first men encountered, some sort of personification of Morgoth or one of his agents. And the problem they were faced with is really, I guess, when you boil it down to its essentials, it's very similar, like you said, to Sauron in Eregion with the Rings of Power, Sauron in Numenor. A lot of what Morgoth even in Valinor, Melkor among the Noldor, boils down to, hey, I can see that you're struggling with goal X, which is probably a good goal in itself. For I guess the earliest men, it would be things like survival and making forks and growing food or something.
I think he provides them with food and abundance and all that. It's all the stuff that you would think early man would, they're struggling to survive. Look what I can provide you for absolutely nothing. But then eventually it's, I'll provide you with a tenth of that if you worship me and sacrifice each other. It becomes so depraved, and evil always ends in human sacrifice. That's the the end goal for these. Happens in Numenor as well. It's almost
Yes.
like the highest form of corruption. If you can start killing each other and worshiping me, get what you want. Um, that's the what else could an evil figure crave from these beings if you're actually taking it out on each other? It's depraved, as I say.
Yeah, it's kind of the ultimate expression of the will to power and the will to dominate all life. Um, yeah, the evil figures, I think, do a really good job of taking basically like at least neutral, and usually like pretty good aims and goals, like survival and eating and being creative and healing the ills of the earth and taking care of my people and all that. And they sneak in just this little tiny sliver of, and wouldn't that be cool for me? Wouldn't that make me feel good? Wouldn't that increase my own power and influence and everything? So that kind of they start with that, with like 1% of the motivation is personal gratification and I guess ego and power, and then they gradually shift it until it's 50-50, and now it's like 75, and now it's like I'm gonna kill people because there's I'm gonna sacrifice people, literally, in a temple, kill them for the sake of my own sort of power and expression of my control over not just other, not just like the world, not like this river, I'm going to make it flow a different direction, or this person, I'm going to persuade them to make a different decision. I'm just going to kill them. I'm going to like remove their ability to interact with Arda, because I mean
Yeah,
incarnation.
to be
um
essentially they're removed from everything, and he stretches it even further. Like, I forgot to add this part, which is it's almost like the culmination of his early corruption of man, where um, he gets all angry with them and he stopped providing for them, and they're all worshipping him, and then he bursts into flames and disappears, and they're now completely lost because they've had this being provide for them, and I know it's now, like you said, it's went from I'll give you everything for nothing, and then it's 50-50, 75, 90-10, and he's providing them less and less and less. They've reached the point where he's not really providing them anything. They're just worshipping him. But then he disappears, and they are left their own devices, and the ones that he's already corrupted start punishing, tormenting, and killing others in order to please this god who's now abandoned them, in order to maybe get them to come back. And I can't think of anything more. I said before that was like the most corrupt thing. That seems to be the most corrupt thing, where he's left them, and they're now doing it without him pushing them to do it through his will. He's got these men murdering the weak for their own benefit and to please him when he's not even there. He's succeeded, so he doesn't actually need to appear before them anymore, and that's the corruption complete in a sense.
Yeah, it's almost like under the guise of worshiping, the voice or Morgoth or whoever, Melkor, whoever it happens to be, the Lord of the Dark is what
Sauron.
what Sauron goes to in Numenor. Um, Under the guise of kind of worshiping that, they almost end up making, idolizing their own will. They're kind of making idols of their own ability to control and have power and to dominate. And then sort of the expression of that, the by the end of it, it becomes just sort of an image of it is this idea of Melkor, who wanted his will to be the only will so hard that it, first of all, it permanently tainted all of reality, and then from his perspective, the only acceptable outcome was that if he couldn't control the world, which of course he couldn't, we got into the reasons why, as long as it existed outside of himself as something to control, it still had existence independent of him. And that was intolerable. And so, you're worshiping this embodiment of nihilistic solipsism. It's all about me to the point where I will destroy everything that is not me just because it's not me and I can only control what is me. And then, of course, like, once you've gotten to that point, you really have no self-control at all, in a sense. This
Yeah,
okay.
that's the divine kind of. Sorry, just to finish
Yeah,
that point, that's the divine level of uh, arrogance and ego and pride. It's the same with Sauron as well. It's we can't really comprehend how vast their wills are, and it's like Morgoth takes solipsism and these kind of things to the absolute extreme, where it seems like he possibly could achieve it. Same with Sauron taking his um, pride and ego to the extreme. It's a tyrant, a divine tyrant. So far beyond what any human could comprehend. It takes these human ideas of tyranny, but I'm going to apply it to a almost like a cosmic scale, which makes it utterly frightening to imagine. But that's the end goal for these figures, and it's I just wanted to say from something about half an hour ago, where we talked about the new shadow and everything. I quite like the idea that when you said like, what's the point? Because man falls back into evil. I've always liked the idea that um, the fall of Sauron is the end of this idea that there is a personification of evil. You were kind of covering it there with the fall of man story, where Elcor appearing before them. Um, these beings have been defeated physically, and it's now as if man has the greatest challenge, which is to attempt to defeat evil that's actually within them, within their hearts. And I think that's an unwinnable battle. It has to more be an understanding of we have the potential to fall to evil, but we always have to fight not to do it. I think that's what the new shadow would have been hopefully about if if Tolkien had continued with that story. But if Sauron had finished writing the story, but I think that's what that would have been about. The evils in men's hearts, and figures like Sauron would take advantage of that. But evil's not defeated just because you defeat a great evil. It's always going to be there, and you have to be vigilant and fight against it. I think that would be the culmination of the Legendarium, basically, and maybe that's what Dagor Dagorath eventually ends up being. Just wanted to make that point before I forgot.
no, I think that's really good kind of node in a lot of ways. It brings a lot together and it goes a lot of directions. because what you were saying earlier about the idea of you have to have faith and you have to have hope, you have to have this Estel, which is more than just like, I think things are probably going to work out based on the data, and more like, even if it looks like things are definitely not going to work out, maybe even especially if it looks like that's the case, that's when it's most important to have some kind of trust, I guess, or hope in the idea that what I'm doing still matters. And I think with Sauron at the end of the Third Age in the War of the Ring, I think Tolkien says this is kind of the last time that the Valar bother to make any kind of direct intervention in the form of sending the Astari and possibly some other interesting bits with the way the wind changes. It's like, I don't know, I feel like Manwë was maybe putting his thumb on the scales, or, you know, who is it that sent Faramir and then ultimately Boromir that vision? It's like, well, we know of at least one Valar who likes to do that. At least two Valar who like to do that, actually. They send the Astari because they justify doing that because the men and the remnants of the elves, and I guess the 5 dwarves who are still, you know, forming a breeding population at this point, because Aule really did not think that through, because he should have talked to his wife, and his wife would have been like, if you're creating mammals, this is the proportion you need to have to like maintain replacement rates, but you didn't do that. Always listen to your wives. Men who are supposed to be the rising stars at this moment in artist history are up against not only their own hearts and minds and like the corruption of their wills, but also up against Sauron, who is taking unfair advantage of a variety of things. And so the Valar say, well, you know, if we just let Sauron do what he wants, they don't have a chance. That's not even really the battle that they're supposed to be fighting, let alone one that they can actually, you know, win. So we will give a final nudge in the form of the Astari, and then, like I said, I think there's maybe a couple little elbowings here and there, little corrections for fate, that you can maybe see evidence for in The Lord of the Rings. But then at the end of that, when they've defeated, you know, Sauron is defeated, hooray, all of the elves are going, all of the rings have ceased to function, and, you know, magic is going to leave the world. That's the idea. That's why the end of The Lord of the Rings is kind of a downer in a lot of ways. And men are going to take over. And then within a generation, yes, they're going to be, you know, I think in one sense, Tolkien was like, this is too dark, because it looks like it's invalidating the whole like epic that came before, and, you know, Frodo and Sam and everything they go through, and only to come to this point of like, well, within 100 years, men are back to actively soliciting, you know, the intervention of what they imagine is going to be, you know, figures like Sauron and Morgoth. But in a sense, that's the story continue. You know, that's the tale not having an end, because it's the same fight. It's just taken on a non-personified form of, you know, this is what Denethor should have been doing, and what Faramir did do. You know, you wake up, you're like, this is gonna suck, there's no way we can win this. And then it's like, well, it's my job to try anyway, so I'm gonna try to make the right decision. I'm gonna try to not let fear and arrogance and paranoia blind me. And I'm gonna, you know, try my best to do my best. And if you do that, what tends to happen is that you get a good, like, actual outcome in The Lord of the Rings, because it's a fictional universe. So Tolkien can do that. He can be like, and they didn't die, and it was all okay, and Sam had many children. He did not get melted by lava. But then even when it doesn't necessarily have, like, you don't necessarily win cosmically in The Lord of the Rings, and in Middle-earth at least, we're supposed to believe that you've won the internal battle, and that's what counts. Doubling back quite a bit to the idea of men entering Beleriand, and they're fleeing Morgoth, and they show up and they're like, you know, cool, we've escaped. We're looking for the actual gods, we're looking for the paradise we were promised, without, like, the lies of the person who was falsely promising it to us, only to find, so first they find the elves, they, you know, House of Beor runs into Finrod, and they think he's a god. And Finrod has to be like, no, 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 I'm not a god. I'm just an elf. I'm like you. We're basically cousins. And they're like, but you're so pretty. He's like, yeah, I know, but don't be fooled by it. And he's like, well, I mean, there are creatures way more powerful than me. There's the Valar. And then men get all excited and they're like, oh, the Valar, maybe they're the gods. Maybe they're, the ones that are going to keep us safe. And Finrod's like, actually,
I think
probably not.
that's the perfect explanation of when people ask why didn't the Valar sweep in and help men and all this kind of thing, even men of the Third Age. If Gandalf had appeared as Elorinn to them, they would have wanted to worship him or run away. It's and if the Valar come over, where it would be the same thing but to an even greater scale. It's you have to. That's one of the things that Tolkien's always saying they have to be careful about is these demonstrations of power and influence, and this is going to, even without you meaning it to, overwhelm their free will in a way. Where if Gandalf had appeared in his true form and says, "I recommend we do this," who's going to say no? He'd essentially be leading them and commanding them instead of influencing them. I think meeting the elves, like you say, with when the men go west, that's one of the good things that comes from escaping the shadow. In a way, they have reached a point of light where it can't be anything but a good thing that the men of the East run into the likes of Finrod, who teaches them and guides them, which is what elves are meant to do. And that elevates these men to being the greatest of their kind, which stretches all the way through to the Edain going to Numenor. I know that has all its own problems that come later, but the elves have done their job there quite willingly, where they've taken in these men who are still pretty new to the world and naive about everything, like you were saying. Oh, can we not just go and meet the Valar then? It's like they're not really understanding how things work. It's how are they meant to? And elves are supposed to guide them in that respect, and they do. And it ends up being man's fault later that they fall, which is the debate about whether it's in their very nature that they're going to do that. But I think that's the shining light from the escape of Morgoth. It's running into, by chance, if we call it that, Finrod of all beings. It's you run into a better elf in that moment. It was meant to be.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that idea of the Estelle, where having seen up close at first hand that this will to power creates cruelty and suffering and misery and ultimately privation, then they attempt to reject it. They're like, well, we'll just have nothing to do with that. We'll just go and we'll find someone, we'll find beings more powerful than us who can tell us what's right and wrong, who can basically take the responsibility off of our shoulders. And instead they come into war-torn Beleriand, so they have to, and then, like you said, they meet Finrod. And Finrod is the one. You couldn't ask for a better person to talk to, because he's Finrod and he's naturally curious and has really good Assanway, so you can communicate with them even though they don't have a common tongue yet. And he's kind and valorous and faithful, but importantly, he's also one of the Noldor and one of the exiles. And although he took no part in the kinslaying, he still kind of indirectly went along with the agenda of those who did. And his great uncle is not very happy with him. And he's got a lot of yeah, he's got a lot of. I think when he and Sauron have their duel, one of the points that always stands out to me in that story is that Finrod and Sauron Sauron are contesting. They're referencing different things in an attempt to kind of control the narrative, I guess. Sauron brings up chains and control, and Finrod's like, ah, yes, but what if it breaks? And the thing that, Sauron hits on right before Finrod falls is, and then all y'all elves killed each other, and you couldn't stop it, and, remember that, Finrod? And he's like, yes, I do. I'm gonna have a blue screen of death moment here while the rest of my companions get rounded up and chained to a wall. So the fact that Finrod is himself fallen, not being a man, being born into the bliss of Valinor at the noontide of its glory, and still having seen that, no, don't worship us elves, we're a mess. We are a hot mess, man. Don't even worship the Valar because they've got their own issues going on. That's interesting.
Imagine they'd run into one of the Vanyar, for example, if Bear and these people, it's like they'd think they were gods. I'm not saying the Vanyar would accept that, but they would probably just start praising the Valar and making them seem even greater men, and that they'd have a yearning to meet them even more. And they're completely wrong people to guide men in this moment. So you're spot on. It's Finrod is fallen in his way, and he becomes the teacher and guide in an effort to stop this happening with the race of men. But he only has a certain limit to his own influence and strength. It's still down to them, but he does his very best, I think, and it's no coincidence that the ones he meets and guides become the greatest of men who revere Finrod and don't, very importantly, don't worship him. They revere him as a guide and friend that was there for them the whole time. I think that's, again, not a coincidence. It was meant to be.
Yeah, it's one of those a chance meeting, as we say in Middle Earth, moments.
Yeah.
And
Definitely.
I had never had this thought before, but as we've been discussing it, and Finrod meeting the men, and both of them kind of having a history behind them, impelling them to this moment where Finrod's like, well, look, man, you can go to Valinor if you want. Evil's going to find you there, because it found us there, and you can help us, but you can't, you're going to be our brothers in arms. You're not going to be our, we're not going to be able to protect you or care for you or absolve you of anything. You've just got to fight the fight with us. And the men are like, well, I mean, you seem to know what you're talking about. I guess we'll go with it. And that's why one of his titles is Friend of Men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They rise to that challenge quite surprisingly quickly and admirably, to the point where you probably think that Morgoth would feel how much of an influence did I actually have on these beings, because the weaker, more corruptible ones are the ones that stayed behind, and the greatest of men were the ones that overcame that will and headed west. So it's almost as if Morgoth what if he'd left them all alone? Would any of the men ever have wandered west? But because he's stuck his nose in and tried to have it all his own way, he's actually drawn some of his greatest enemies to him. He's created some of his greatest enemies. It's another one of these be careful what you wish for kind of things, where Melkor is directly responsible for some of his greatest foes. If he hadn't done that, then if we follow the Dagor Dagorath tale, different versions and everything, but Morgoth created Túrin, basically, through his actions, and one of the traditions is Túrin that brings him his final end as justice for the entire race of men. So it's evil causing its own downfall, as always. I think that's quite a nice thing that Tolkien's done there in the writing as well. It's it's not hopeless in the end. You do get temporary suffering, but look at look how the race of men was elevated based on the corruptive influence of Melkor. They became greater than maybe they potentially could have been if they were left alone in the East. That's a debatable thing, but just trying to say that the men that head west are incredible, uh, valiant and brave, courageous men who are rightly rewarded through their suffering at the end of the First Age. Even if it's debatable that the Valar chose to do it that way, they should have been rewarded in some way for stepping into that fight, I think.
Yeah, I think that this is just another example of, and it kind of does, maybe it's the reason why you can have Estelle, is that in the moments where it seems like Morgoth has won just definitively and absolutely, those tend to be the exact moments where down the line, we don't know how far down the line, and that's kind of a problem, but this is the moment that sets up the reversal that's coming. So, men, particularly the House of Beor and their friendship with Finrod, ultimately leads to Morgoth losing a Silmaril, which is like his most, apart from after Fingolfin, it's one of his most personally humiliating moments, and it kind of messes things up for him, and it gets a Silmaril out of his control, which is, he's really unhappy about that for a variety of reasons. Sauron gets beat up in the process as well, which again, you have to imagine, I don't know how long it takes Sauron to recover from being ragdolled by Huon, but it seems like it was a significant setback because we don't really hear about Sauron Gorthauer doing anything for the rest of the First Age. I feel like he's licking his wounds for a long time.
I don't think this is quite an interesting thing. I don't know what you think about it, but I know that the Silmarillion, we don't need to go into the history of how it was written and everything, but it really does seem like Sauron hides from Morgoth after he's defeated and doesn't appear again until he goes to Eonwe to plead for forgiveness, and he's apparently repenting. There's no text that really indicates that in the War of Wrath that Sauron was. I wouldn't be surprised if he was involved, but there's no text that says he was involved, and I don't know what you think about that. If I know it's maybe a bit off course here, but it's just when you brought that up, it seems that he is licking his wounds and he's terrified of returning to Morgoth, and he just hides in the forest, and that's quite close to the end of Morgoth days, and I wouldn't be surprised if Sauron didn't get to return to Morgoth before his master ends up being defeated, almost as if he can use that as an excuse to repent, because I wasn't here. No, it's I'd already left. It's I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I did a whole. So, I think it was last year. I did Sauron's Lost Years, so I did a video on kind of the early Second Age, and this idea that we see Sauron come out and have this repentance, and then Anne was like, well, like, get your butt back to Valinor, and it's not for me to decide, it's for the Valar to decide how you're gonna fix this. And Sauron's like, but what if I didn't? And then he disappears, and it's just like, we see like a note where it's like circa the year 1000 of the Second Age or something. It's like Sauron starts to, he begins to stir again, or he starts to like do stuff. It's like, so for like 1200 years, this guy's what, just like kind of bumming around, hitchhiking, like hiding in a cave. So that kind of sparked me to really think about, well, what do we know about Sauron in the First Age after the Luthien debacle? And based on everything I can see, so first of all, I think, like you said, the history of the composition and everything, I think probably Tolkien just didn't, his first go through, he probably just didn't really bother to give Sauron a story because Gorthar Thu wasn't that important of a figure at that point. But then going back, I think he definitely had ample opportunity to, make some footnote or something where it's like, I should have Sauron, mention that Sauron was important during the War of Wrath, because of course he would have been. It's like he never does that. And based on everything I know, which is not a lot, but everything I know about the relationship of Ainur to their bodies, and especially evil Ainur, and how Morgoth is faring at this point in time, and then especially, this is the thing that always gets me. So I know Lay of Lathian is an older text, and it's not exactly canonical, and our boy is still going by Thu, and he's still like a sorcerer. But there's this moment in the Lay of Lathian where, and I think it's echoed a little bit in the prose version in the Silmarillion, where Beren is dressed as Draugluin. He's in the Wolfheim. And Luthien is Thringwithil. So they are, like, dressed as Sauron's, like, his right-hand wolf and his vampire messenger woman. And they're trying to sneak into Angband. And Karkaroth stands up and gives him a good sniff, and he's suspicious. And he says, I heard you got beat up, Dad, to what he thinks is Draugluin, or what looks like Draugluin. It doesn't quite smell right to him, I guess. The word was going around that you got killed in Tol Sirion, which of course the actual Draugluin did. And, oh, no, that wasn't me. You're thinking of someone else. And Karkaroth lets him in. So nobody has told Morgoth what happened. Yeah. It takes him, like, Beren gets shot, they have to recover, they have to wait until spring, he has to cross the Anfield with, like, months have passed, and nobody has mentioned to Morgoth that, oh, by the way, boss, I totally lost that island, I got my butt kicked by a girl and a dog, all of my werewolves are dead, my fortress is crumbled, all of my captives have escaped, and, like, all that Angband is getting of this is apparently rumors. Like Karkaroth's the guard dog that is set to, because Morgoth has heard this rumor that, I think it's against Huan, that Huan is going to cause problems for him. So the fact that Beren can dress up as a dead wolf and make it into Angband without anyone saying, like, we got an official report that you are officially dead, bro. And they're like, oh, we're bringing news from Sauron. And everyone's like, oh, okay, seems reasonable. It's like, no, he doesn't have anything to report. He's literally hiding in the trees, licking the blood from his own throat. So I very much get the sense, long story short, I very much get the sense that Sauron is hiding probably in, I mean, we know he retreats into Tol Angarhoth and fills it with horror, quote unquote. I think Tolfuin, the island that's left on the maps of the Third Age, is they've figured that that's supposed to be the highlands of where Sauron, the woods that he retreated to. So I imagine him in the woods hiding out. He pops his head up, sees that, like, the host of the Valar has arrived on the western shore, and he's like, I am not. That is
because
not me, bro.
you don't think that he would maybe have been involved in Gondolin or something like that. It's quite a few things happen after Osirion, and Sauron's just not mentioned. But again, we can't overlook the text, because you were quite right in saying that the importance of Sauron hadn't been established yet. And you know that Tolkien, especially with someone like Galadriel, had no problem going back and changing things. And if he had another go at the Silmarillion, I think Sauron would be mentioned even more. But this period, at the end of the Silmarillion, is quite notorious for Christopher not wanting to add too much or change too much, and it's got the least amount of text there. So we can't just say, because Sauron is not mentioned, we know exactly what he was doing. But you're kind of just, is a bit curious, you're just left wondering. And it also fits his character, though, what you're saying. It's if can we imagine that Sauron would be defeated in shame, lose his charge? He's to look after this fortress and watchtower, and he loses it, and humiliatingly loses it, has to run and hide. He's not going to be in a rush to go back to Morgoth and say, I lost. He maybe wants to achieve something to then go back and say, this happened, but then I did this, and try and kind of grovel his way back in. And he maybe runs out of time for doing that. Or he's just absolutely shamed and is waiting to be dragged back. And that never happens. But I think it's well within his character to be afraid of reporting the failure, because he's had so many successes from Morgoth. He's his greatest servant, and this one's just absolutely humiliating at a time when Morgoth's needing he's needing his victories, and his greatest servant's now out of commission for a while. I don't see Sauron as in any rush to go back, and I like to imagine that he never did. He used that to his advantage when Morgoth was taken away. He was absolutely terrified when that happened. I just think that's his character. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think it's kind of one of those serendipity moments where, was this all part of some master plan on Tolkien's part? Like, we know that's not the case. We know, if anything, it's the opposite. It's that the man has 5 different plans and he's switching between them just constantly. Which, I mean, hashtag relatable. So I think it's the reason that it is that way is just kind of because that's how it turned out, and Tolkien didn't realize. But I think that it works very well for what Tolkien later developed of his character. And, you know, maybe there was some stuff that he never wrote down, but kind of some considerations going back and forth in his mind where he's like, well, should I have Sauron, you know, do something in the War of Wrath since it's going to become this big thing, or do I have to account for the period between being defeated by Luthien and coming before Anwe? And maybe he's like, no, I don't think I do. I think, you know, I don't know that the boy would have gotten up to anything particularly exciting at that point. It's much more in line with what I now consider to be his character, that he would lie low and kind of wait to see which way the winds had shifted. And I think there's this kind of little bit confusing quote, at least confusing on the surface, about his repentance when he goes before Anwe, and he's like, look, clearly I threw in with the wrong party because he lost. You know, if I had made the right decision, I would have been on the winning side here. So I chose the side that lost, and that was a mistake on my part. But then when Anwe's like, well, if you're really sorry, you know, if you really feel bad and you feel grief for the harm that you have done, come back to Valinor, and we'll figure out some way for you to, like, heal from that and try to heal others from the damage you've inflicted. And Sauron's like, but I'm not about that. I'm kind of more about being in control of things and being really cool and super awesome, and everyone tells me how cool and awesome I am, so I'm gonna go hide. and like, then in a few centuries when I'm feeling better, I'll go and hang out with those Noldor. They seem to be on a similar wavelength. So there's this quote that his repentance is somewhat sincere, but it's also fear-based. And I think it's repentance in the sense of he regrets having misjudged the situation. Not so much that he's necessarily feeling bad at this point, because, like, the things he did to Gorlim alone should be written up in multiple codes.
Yeah, it's reprehensible.
And that's leaving aside Finrod and all of it. And, you know, if he wasn't involved in the original corruption of mankind, then he probably appeared before some of the Edain in Beleriand, and what is it? Is it Amlak whose guys he steals? And like makes a speech and sends half of them, like, heading back across the mountains. He's done some very terrible things in the First Age, and I think to get to that point, he would not be like, oh, boo-hoo, what have I done? Now I feel so bad for the elves and men. He's like, no. I just didn't, this wasn't the right plan. I used the wrong strategy. I'm sorry for the error in judgment I've made. Can I please go back and like rerun the calculations And Aang was like, how about you humble yourself? He's like, no, that was not on my agenda. Um, so we've started talking about Sauron, which I think that both of us could easily spend a lot more time talking about Sauron, and we're gonna try and make sure that we make some time to dedicate just to him. But it is hard. I think we said this earlier. It is hard to talk about Morgoth without talking about Sauron, both in the sense that like they're two characters that have quite a lot to do with each other, but also in the sense that so much of what we know about each one is because he's been contrasted with the other ones. So Morgoth's ring is a parallel to Sauron's ring, but it's different in these ways. Morgoth was had reached this level of nihilistic madness, whereas Sauron was only yay high, and that kind of thing. One of them loves order, and the other one eventually just wants chaos and dissolution. So
because we will talk about it because I've got so much to say about the repentance and everything. But you're right, they are tied together, and it would almost do a service to the character of Sauron if it was like a footnote in this discussion. I think even the repentance with Eonwe and his his fall into becoming Morgoth returned in the Third Age deserves a whole discussion just about him, which I'm sure he would love. But he's important enough that we should focus an entire discussion on him, and even that repentance conversation. I could probably talk for a long time about that because I find that quite fascinating how many different opinions people have about what he was doing there. Because mine's is no, I don't want to get into it, but mine's is slightly different from how you view it. But we'll get to that
no, we
another
will.
time. Make sure to remember that.
Yeah. So let's see. We've been at it for an hour and a half. So we're probably coming down to any last things we want to talk about. One of the things that we mentioned earlier, and I think maybe we have an opportunity to just touch on it, and this has to do with stuff that we've talked about going all the way back to Morgoth emerging as a much more important character, him becoming this like Luciferian paragon figure, his role in corrupting mankind, but then also his role as a general force of corruption. But then was that part of the plan all along, or to what extent was it a plan? Are there multiple plans? And like Tolkien, Eru just has 5 plans going and is switching between all of them depending on the choices that people make. So that all kind of is necessary background to the question of Morgoth, Melkor, and Feanor.
Yes.
And as characters, very similar in a lot of ways, even down to the point of them being firstborn sons. I know that's a bit of a metaphor in the Valaran sense, but firstborn sons whose younger brothers then supplant them for the kingship, and they never get over it. They both want to have a lot of children. Both very creative, obsessed with light, that kind of thing, and their arcs follow very similar, and then where dissimilar, then sort of parallel or inverted courses. And that's as characters. And then there's also the question of they actually have an in-universe relationship, which I've always found hilarious. Namely that at least in the final version, or the latest versions, Feanor hates Melkor like on sight, never comes around. The closest he gets is that moment where he's been banished, and Melkor's like, "Yeah, you've been banished, man. Sucks, doesn't it?" Feanor's like, "Leave, just leave now." So they hate
No
each other
one's ever
forever.
looked through him. Yeah, no one's ever looked through him as well since like Varda did, where Melkor fears her because she seems to really understand him at his very nature more than Manwë would. But Melkor tries his usual tricks with Feanor and extends his hand a bit too far, and is quite shocked. I just always laugh at the image of um, Fëanor slamming the door in Melkor's face at this. We're talking earlier at the start of this discussion about him being a cosmic force descending into Earth and smoke and fire and everything, and he gets a door slammed in his face when he can't hide that he's absolutely craving these Silmarils that Fëanor's made, and Fëanor just sees right through him. But as you're hinting at here, Fëanor can see right through him because they have quite similar natures. If anyone's going to understand Melkor with his creativity and his possessiveness and jealousy and these sorts of things, it's going to be Fëanor. So Melkor can't trick Fëanor because he's essentially trying to trick himself. He's trying to trick someone who understands him as well as he probably does, and they both just end up absolutely hating each other, but for different reasons. I think Melkor would hate Fëanor because he's arguably more creative than him and is able to achieve things that he can't achieve, even though he's quote unquote just an elf. And because he is understood by him, Melkor doesn't like that. He doesn't like not being able to appear a certain way in front of who he wants. If he has to appear as himself, he's naked, they're seeing right through him, and what can he hope to achieve if he's not able to deceive or corrupt? And Fëanor, as I say, more than anyone since Varda, is able to see right through him, and it's just one of the great moments. The jail crow of Mandos, insult. That's even more insulting than being called Morgoth. I think it's something that he would constantly remember and never forgive, because that's what Melkor's like.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted your train of
No, you're
thought.
right. That's exactly it. That's where I was going. Where Melkor's like problem is that he brings up the Silmarils, and Fëanor instantly recognizes Melkor's wanting to get the Silmarils because Fëanor has a similar. I mean, it's implicit, but the idea is because Fëanor himself feels the same way, and he sees. It's like you said, he sees through him, but instead of, I feel like, Varda perceives him, I guess, because she's the light. She's a metaphor. She's a Valier, so she can handle being a metaphor personified. She is the light, and that's the thing that I always love about her and Manwë, is that Manwë can see because he's got the light next to him. Varda can hear all the prayers because she's got the wind next to her. So Varda's what illuminates, and she not only, sees through Melkor and his pretensions, but also shows him up to himself kind of a way. He wants to appear a certain way to others to reinforce his own view of himself, I think, that he wants to be omnipotent, and he wants power that he knows deep down that he doesn't have. So he's, the whole history of the rest of Middle-earth really is just Melkor's insistence to try and make reality to conform to his own vision of what he wants to be and what he deep down knows that he can't be, and he's getting farther and farther away from. Which is why the other thing you said, Fëanor being more creative than Melkor, despite being, quote, just an elf. But he's one of the children of Eru. He's, direct from the thought of that which is beyond the parts of Arda that the Valar have control of. So he's got, not to the same extent as men, but he's got that radical, that he's got the spark, he's got the secret fire. And Melkor ends up hating him, of course, but is desperate to corrupt him, influence him, get him on side, because he sees that that's the most powerful one. He's got the gift. And if I can get him to be on my side, it's similar to, you imagine kind of how he would have felt about Sauron, who's this, supposedly this pretty talented Maya in the service of Aule. And apparently one of the names that he went by early on was Myron, was the admirable one, which, like, people have various things. Aloran is, like, supposedly something to do with dreams, and and Ulmo is the poorer because he's always making things go whoosh. And Myron,
Because
I know it's
Myron could be admirable, excellent as well. So
yeah,
when he tag Myron, it was apparently what a title! It was apparently King Excellent. It's what an ego this guy has.
it is. Well, I mean, he that's the term he wants for himself. So he at least sees himself, and we don't know exactly the source. Myron's Quenya, I think, in derivation. So it's not one of his it's not what the Valar would have called him before the elves showed up. Though it might be a translation of it, but Sauron has this image of himself as people look at me and they see like, wow, what a guy. And that's apparently that's Melkor recognizes that in Sauron, one supposes, and that's how he's able to be like, hey, you want to be awesome, come over here to the awesome side, we've got awesome cookies. So yeah, same thing with Feanor. He looks at Feanor, he's like, oh, I want that, that's the one I want. But Feanor just keeps, the only way he manages to get Feanor on board is by spreading rumors through other people that can't be traced back to him. So, Feanor hears it from a third party. What he doesn't realize are the philosophies of Melkor, and that's what starts to sway him. The other interesting thing, talking about, corruptibility and so forth, is that, and this is something that was definitely a late emergence in the Silmarillion, and I'll try not to go too crazy on it because it's stuff that I'm working through right now with the Noldor family drama. But as of the late versions of the story of the Flight of the Noldor, this idea that Finwë married Miriel and had one son, and then Miriel died, and it was weird, and the Valar had to write an exception to the laws, and then Finwë remarried and had more sons, and then those sons didn't like each other very well. And all of this is before they let Melkor out of Mondos. It goes back to what you were saying about how no matter what Melkor does, it always ends up, backfiring on him because there's nothing he can do that's not part of the plan. Well, even if Melkor gets released into Valinor and doesn't directly immediately start targeting the sons of Finwë, particularly the eldest, there's already problems. There's Miriel dying when she shouldn't have. And that could be a result of Morgoth, the corruption that Morgoth's already inflicted. So all Melkor really does, I think, when it comes to the Noldor, is just accelerates what is already there, which kind of puts Feanor even more so aligned with Melkor in that he is the sort of the sower of the original discord, at least as far as elves are concerned.
Yeah, and that's common for the evil figures. I've said in all my Numenor videos that Numenor would have fallen. I don't know if already had fallen, but it would have ended. I don't know if it would have ended in such dramatic fashion with trying to invade Valinor, but there would have been some sort of civil war or attack of elves and Aresia or something like that, and it may have taken centuries to happen. Sauron being on Numenor accelerated it. It's they were already teetering over the edge, and he gave them a little nudge and let them step off. He didn't cause the downfall of Numenor. It had been happening for a long time, and he just came along at the end and just made it happen a little faster than it would have. And yeah, you're right, Melkor. This is where they're most successful. These beings that are trying to deceive and corrupt. Where you're absolutely right. When Melkor came out of Mandos, he didn't have to start anew with some sort of plan to corrupt. I know he came out and he was immediately like, "Well, I'm going to get to work again," but all those seeds were already there, and because Feanor is so like Melkor as well, it would have happened in time. Something bad would have happened, but Melkor, like all these evil figures, are impatient as well. They want results immediately, and gets to work with the rumors and everything like that. And it does work. Again, he creates a great enemy in Fëanor and even greater enemies in the Noldor themselves. Again, it's exactly like I said back with the Men of the East. It's Melkor's creating his greatest enemies by um, sticking his finger in where it's not supposed to be. It's just what they're like. They can't help themselves and they're so impatient. That's Saruman, Sauron, Morgoth. Patience leads to downfalls, basically. But I wanted to run something by you as well about because I know you made a video on Morgoth and Fëanor, which are a very very short backstory here. I wrote an article post thing about this topic back in 2018 or 2019 it was, and after I published that, I then was doing a little research on it, and I saw that someone else had published something similar, and I think hers was actually better. She covered a few more points, and we got into a discussion about it. And when I made my channel, eventually, when I was confident enough to do this sort of topic, I said I'm going to make that video, and I'd run this by her, and I said, "Do you mind if I fill in what you added to the discussion as well?" And she's like, "Yeah, that's good." And I was writing the video and everything. 3/4 the way through the video, got the subscriber notification that Chronicles Gondor's released Fëanor and Morgoth, and I was like, that's like the third time this has happened. So at the very beginning of this discussion, I was saying we're quite similar channels, cover similar things. The topics are quite unique. I don't think any other channels have really covered Fëanor and Morgoth being similar. And you beat me to it by what would have been about 2 weeks, I think. And so this is a topic I really, really like. But there's one thing, my whole point here is that there's one thing that I was framing my whole discussion around, and it's this idea of Tolkien inverting classic mythology with Fëanor and Morgoth, where they're both like tales of Prometheus, but the anti-Prometheus. So for those that don't know, Prometheus was the Titan who stole fire or knowledge from the gods and gave it to mankind, and they weren't meant to have it. And this caused man to extend beyond his reach, apparently, and all that kind of thing. But if you look at Fëanor and Morgoth, this is why I was framing it around these figures. Both of them are like that, but it's been inverted, where it's actually the Valar, or the lowercase g gods in this case, who want to share light with the world in the form of the two trees, and when they want to break the Silmarils to reinvigorate the trees after they were attacked. And it's, first of all, Fëanor, who's the anti-Prometheus in this case, who wants the light contained. He wants to keep it for himself and not share it with the world. And it's the gods that do want to share it. And Morgoth then steals it from Fëanor and escapes with it, but again, to hoard it for himself, not to share it with the world. So the two greatest creative figures both snatch this creative force of light for themselves. Then it ends up being one of the gods, we call him that with Eonwe, who returns the light to the gods, but they then display it for the entire world in the form of, sorry, not Eonwe, Erendil, sorry. They then display it in the form of the Star of Erendil, which is then the light that's shared with the world for all time. And that's where the whole thing was framed around that. But then every other point that I made about the comparison between them, you did make in the video as well. So that kind of gave me, that's not a bad thing. That kind of makes me think, oh, I'm not just speaking nonsense. It's other people are seeing this as well, because this is when you get to your 15th or 20th reading or Silmarillion or whatever, you start to notice these I was about to say these similarities, these similarities
Wow.
between Morgoth and Fëanor. I don't know. I don't know what you think about that. If you how familiar you are with that story, but do you think, based on what I've said, that maybe Tolkien, who definitely know this kind of story, would consciously have made it that way, or do you think it's a happy coincidence that the it's all been flipped on its head? It's like an inverted mythology, almost tapping into what you said at the beginning of you don't create new mythologies, you pick up pieces from other ones and it makes something different. And I've felt for quite a long time that that's what was achieved with the Silmarils, and light in this case being fire, something out of reach for your ordinary person, and it's now been flipped in its head where those that were in charge of it actually wanted to give it out to the world, and it was individuals who craved it for their own. So I know that's a lot I've just said, but I just don't know if you've got anything to say about that.
Yeah, no, a lot. I've got a lot of response, a large response. And you should, I mean, if you ever get an inkling to revisit it or get into some niche component of it, you should put something up on Melkor and Fëanor, because usually I find I've definitely had this experience both with your channel and with others where I have an idea um, of something that I'm, potentially working on. I don't think it's quite been that dramatic where I was in the process of writing
Writing.
writing a video and then I see someone's made that video. Um, but yeah, I think because, as you said, the two of us tend to gravitate towards similar topics of kind of the more analytical but almost speculative, in the sense of like, well, I think it might be meaning something like this, or I think this is a possible parallel that you could argue for, kind of a thing. Yeah, I think that we gravitate towards similar topics, but I've always found that even when it's something where I'm like, oh, he's gonna go that direction with it, oh, okay, like I've had that thought before, and then I watch the video or I read the blog post or whatever, and I'm like, okay, I'd had something like that thought, or I'd noticed that similarity, but I hadn't brought the same stuff to it. Um, and then it makes me change my opinion, or it gives me a new opinion, which coincidentally is an example of what I'm now going to talk about with Melkor and Fëanor and light and everything. Um, Melkor originally wants to find, he goes into the void seeking the flame imperishable. And that's where he starts to conceive of ideas different from those of his brethren. That's, I guess, if he has like an arc, that's like the sort of source of his corruption is his time questing through nothingness, trying to find the fire. And the Silmarillion very casually says like, well, he didn't find it because it's with Eru. So it's like, so it was there all along. His problem was thinking that it was something that you could find and could hold. And so then we see iterations of this with first the lamps that are giving light throughout Arda, and then Melkor at that point comes and knocks them over, and then they ruin things, and so then the Valar kind of scoop them up and gather them into these trees, which sort of are like a little glade diffuser, but for like light, just sort of poofing it into the atmosphere, and then it sort of collects as dew and gets sucked up by the trees, and it's sort of the cyclical thing, illuminating Aben, illuminating Valinor. And then Fëanor wants to preserve that, but also contain it, and makes the Silmarils, which Melkor then covets, even though, like, they're in Valinor. The light is everywhere. Like, you walk outside and it, like, drips on you practically. You see a lot more of this. Like, it's practically like it's a physical saturating force in Valinor. It's
He
almost
doesn't want that, though. He wants it. Now, remember, when he takes the light, he goes to the deepest, darkest place on Earth so that no one can see it. It's like this divine thing I said earlier, where he doesn't just take it and seal it for his own. He'll go to extreme lengths to achieve it once, which is, I'm going to make sure no one else can see it. Only I am able to see it. Sorry, just keep
Yeah, no,
interrupting there,
yeah,
but
that's exactly it. Both Feanor and Morgoth both do. Once they get it, they take it and they hide it. Even though it says that the Silmarils are happiest and at their most beautiful when they're getting other forms of light and colors shown on them. That's when they give it, give it back and reflect it back in millions of hues, which is the same thing as like this whole synergy idea or the cauldron of story. It's all the same thing. It all comes back to the same thing, which is that creativity is collaborative in Middle Earth, and I think Tolkien's arguing in the real world. You can't really. There's no idea that's new, but every moment is new, and every the history of your personal life experience forming your mind, and then whatever neurotransmitters happen to be at whatever levels in your brain at the moment, and then two ideas, one from this source, one from that source, but with a flavor from over here, and it's like it's a totally novel combination of things that existed prior. So the same thing, Melkor seeking this flame imperishable that will give him the power of true creativity. Well, the closest he comes to achieving that is like in the music of the Ainur, when he inadvertently creates snow and clouds because his ideas bump up against Ulmo's, and he's got like this massive heat that's just going to scorch everything, and instead it makes something new, but only in combination with other people. Feanor's the same way, hiding the light, and then they call him up after the trees have been destroyed, and before he even knows that Morgoth has taken his Silmarils and killed his daddy. Very upsetting, and it's all Manwë's fault, of course. Let's blame Manwë. Manwë and my useless good-for-nothing half-brother. But before he even knows about any of that, the Valar say, well, if we could break open those Silmarils, we could, maybe revive these trees, and then we would continue to have, like, the light cycle going. So Feanor, what do you say? And he thinks about it, and he's like, I don't know about that. And Aule's like, give the man a minute. This is a big ask. And he takes a minute, and he's like, no, I'm not going to do it. They're mine. I made them. How dare you, demand that I give over what I've made? And Tolkien, I think, has rushed him to this point by saying, like, dude, it was Yavanna's light. You got it from the trees. And then Yavanna's like, she put it into tree form, but it's light, so it probably had something to do with Varda. Like, come on, man. This is not your idea. This is... You could only make this because of what others made before you. Now we're asking you to help us. And you're like, no, it's mine. It's all mine. Mine. So it's, if Melkor had just been like, the flame imperishable is with Eru. If he had just hung around the house, stop being such a rebellious punk and painting his nails black, then he would have been way more creative than if he had been like, I need to do it all by myself. Oh no, the only thing I can do that's all by myself is corrupt and destroy. Rant over. Sorry. And then Prometheus. So yes.
Oh yeah, because it's interesting where I think I mentioned earlier that Melkor was I don't want to say made to be, but when the Valar were created, we're told that in Morgoth's Ring, his Middle Earth, that Melkor was to be the instigator, the creator of new ideas and everything like that, and Manwë was to complete what Melkor would imagine. So this is this collaboration you're talking about, and I just find it interesting based on this whole discussion. There's been certain figures we've brought up where we've kind of realized that for being someone who's apparently so creative, Melkor, he seems to just obsess with capturing the creativity of others for his own. So originally he wanted Varda, and you brought up the good point of the companionship of Manwë and Varda makes both of their strengths even greater. They complement each other, and they're a union because of that. But what would a union of Varda and Melkor be like? Well, Melkor would just want to use Varda's creativity, and he would corrupt it in some way and then claim it as his own. He does it with Sauron. He sees Sauron as quite rightly a very creative figure. One of these Maiar who's nigh as great as the Valar, probably. If it's not Sauron, I don't know who else Tolkien could be talking about. And he wants his creative influence for himself because he can't get Aule. He's never going to get Aule because they hate each other. So he gets his greatest, in my opinion, his greatest student. I don't know who else would be his greatest student. And he corrupts him, use his creativity. And with Fëanor, not only does he um, covet what Fëanor has made, he goes as far as to have his ego be so great that because he's claimed the world as his own, the Silmarils are his. So in Melkor's mind, he probably made Silmarils. That's how like corrupted he is by his own pride and ego. Well, the world's mine. The Silmarils are in the world. I should have them, and they're mine and no one else's. And this is the creativity of Fëanor, which has been influenced by the creativity of Yavanna, which will probably be based on the creativity of Fardal, you said, which would be based on the creativity of Eru. Light as its original thing probably came from Eru. That's why they talk about the light of Eru's face is in Varda and all of that. It's light being the greatest creation in the physical world is probably because it's what reminds them of Eru, who probably exists as some pure light being or something like that. So it's not a surprise that light's such an important thing in Arda. I just thought it was quite interesting with based on what we're saying that what creativity did Melkor actually show for being the most creative, except attempting to corrupt the the creativity of others, who most, especially in the Valar, were quite willing to share. That's what the whole point is. He just wanted to um, use others' creativity and then claim it as his own. That's derivative and highly corruptible. So it's just, I think it's quite interesting that just based on who we're talking about, that he's really got nothing to show for it. He's so jealous of what others are making because he didn't do it. He's not spending any time actually showing what he can do or what has he achieved in the music of the Ainur except of looking over his shoulder at what everyone else is making and well, I didn't make that. That's um, showing how pathetic Melkor is at his core, really, if that's what he's caring about. Um, that's probably why he's my favorite character. I'm calling him pathetic in that, but he's such a deep character when you look beyond. He's a big dark lord. It's I just find all that quite fascinating. It's kind of come up through what we're talking about. What does he have to show for being the most um, creative Allah? There's nothing really. It's just all degradation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the closest he gets is what is it? Eru says something like Melkor hath conceived of himself immoderate heat and cold. He takes basic so like temperature, so like energetic state of I guess matter, and just like turns it up to 11 because of course he does. Which
That comes from the sorry that we were talking very early on about the Book of Lost Tales. Do you remember that from the Book of Lost
yes,
Tales where he's he creates ice. It's not just a result of, like you said earlier, the corrupting the air of Manwë and the water of Ulmo and ice as a result of it. And Melkor could then be like, "Oh, I made that, but I didn't really mean to." But he consciously makes it, and that's what the two lamps, the towers of the two lamps, are then made of ice. Because Ali asks Melkor to, "Can you create the structures?" And it's Manwë and Varda that gather the light and contain it. And Ali will put it all together. It's supposed to be this big collaborative effort for the Avatar and all this. And Melkor comes forward and says, "I've made this indestructible material, like put it up in this," and then it melts. And that comes right back to the folklore type storytelling where you take away a kind of lesson from it and all that. That's what these early versions are really like, because it's as if you're reading it out to children. You say he then created this substance, but it was ice, and then all the children would be like, it's going to melt and it's going to be destroyed. It's like that's what the early tales were like. But um, it's almost like in the early versions, Melkor was more creative because he created the Tumnal, which was called a Tumnat back then in the far north, in a land of cold, and the rest of the Valar didn't really know what that was because it was Melkor's dominion. They were very godlike, where they held dominion over certain substances, and he wanted the Valar to go to individual domains of their choosing, and this was his, and it was the extreme north, which was cold. So just when you were saying there that he does kind of create the extremes, which makes sense for Melkor, it's almost like um, he's still not in the what we got in the last text creatively using that for something. It's always just being injected into someone else's creation and corrupting it, and then taking credit for that and saying he made it, but he's not purely created something himself, which is what the music of the Ainur would allow him to do. He's so focused on what everyone else is achieving on their own, or together, I should say.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most underrated, and I think it would have had to have been a conscious shift in basically between Book of Lost Tales era Melko and his little pranks and his sort of little trickster motivations of, I just kind of want to make things harder for people, to the point where some of the other Valar like make the point of like, well, if it wasn't for Melko, things would sure be boring around here, and maybe he has his place too. Which, I mean, in that version seems justified because he is a creative force.
Yep.
And then Manwë is sort of like, it's very much like this idea of necessary duality, where Manwë is sort of like law and order, but he's a little fusty, and Melkor's a little bit like chaos and violence, but he's a necessary, counterweight to Manwë. Versus toward the end, it's shifted where the big problem with Melkor is he wants to be the only one. He wants to be the tyrant. And Manwë is like, well, you can't stop. Like, we all worked on this together. Don't screw it up for all of us. Like, screw up your own things if you have to, but you have as much right to this as the rest of us do. This is their primordial conflict in the Silmarillion, which is different than what it is in the earlier texts. It's the difference between Manwë wants to assume legitimate authority and Melkor's like, no, don't go with him. He's a square. Like, come on, we need to all do our own thing, and we all need to express ourselves. We can't just all do what Manwë says all the time. Like, gosh, gag me with a spoon. Versus by the end of it, it's like Manwë's the one standing up and saying, like, we all worked on this together. We all have to, agree to have some stake in it. And then he kind of ends up as this. Yeah, he ends up as this like paralyzed figurehead who is defined by his role as being the legitimate and, I guess, democratically sponsored counterpart to Melkor's attempt at tyranny. So it's this total change in the idea of, where does power come from, and how much, the tension between individuality and creativity versus like control and order and stability. Maybe it has something to do with Tolkien's views being a young man versus, kind of maturing and kind of losing maybe a little of his own youthful, chaotic or rebellious streak. But it's a big change, I think, in terms of its implications on what it says about creativity.
Yeah, because in those early versions, it's almost as if, like you're saying, that there's a kind of counterbalance going on. He's a necessary evil, and it's almost as if Melkor is willing to, like Loki would, exist within the laws of the world and achieve what he can with his gifts, which were naturally given to him. And he's not doing anything wrong in his own opinion. He's just different from the rest of them. But when the Legendarium developed, those laws of the universe were the very things that um, Melkor would rebel against. He rebelled instantly. He wanted things his way, and the scale just becomes enormous where he's not happy enough to operate within, I'll just be different from the rest of the Valar. It's so much it's so much greater where I want to overwhelm all of them. I want to corrupt everything they've made. I want to be the greatest, and these very laws of nature and physical reality are the things that I'm going to rebel against. And that's my nature. It's, as I said, the scale has been shifted to an almost incomprehensible level. He's not just being a trickster. I'm going to destroy the lamps by um, making the structures out of ice and kind of hee and running away, like kind of thing. It's like in the later text, he consciously goes out of his way to go and destroy them. Like he lets the Valar make them, and then he comes out of hiding to, well, I'm going to unmake them, and then by destroying them, the symmetry of Arda itself will be disrupted, and I think that's so much greater in terms of the influence of Melkor. I love the old versions that are very mythological, but Melkor going out of his way to go and destroy it, to undo on a massive scale what the Valar have achieved, is that's a great way to demonstrate how Melkor shifted from the early to later texts, where it's hands-on, going out of his way to corrupt and destroy, and it's not just I exist as some counter to the order of Manwë. He wants to rule Manwë and dominate. He doesn't want to coexist with them. It's wants to be Melkor's world that he's claimed as his own, and that's, you don't get higher stakes than that, and that's the shift that Tolkien made, which I really like.
Yeah, I think it kind of gives this centrality to everything that happens from that point on, from the very creation of the world onward, is a variation on the theme to like be horrible and make an Einulindale pun, where Melkor starts it all because he has this will to power. The will to power, Tolkien's argument seems to be, is if you carry that to its logical conclusion, it's also like the will to destruction and for nothingness. And of course, Melkor rebelling against the created order of things, even though he himself is part of that created order and he knows it, which is why the whole thing has to be this elaborate self-deception. And every time someone like a Varda or a Feanor sees through it and sees like what's actually going on with him and points out the contradiction in it, it's shattering to him, and it just, he throws a whole hissy fit about it. So I think it's really nice in terms of what it does for the rest of everything else that comes after it, because everything comes down to people having to choose between their own personal will and power versus, well, I don't really want to do this, but I feel like I have to for reason XYZ. And then the decisions they make in those moments kind of determine how things are going to shake out. But each of those choices is a version of the original conflict, which is, am I going to just be self-centered and destructive and arrogant? But arrogant doesn't seem like enough of a word for what he's working with, this titanically huge ego.
Yeah.
It's like it's the same conflict played out in microcosm. And then one more thing. Oh, yes. Okay, so this is really stupid, but when you said that in the earlier versions, Melko is kind of this portrayed as a necessary evil. And then it made me think of what we had said before and what you said about how every time one of the evil guys achieves some sort of great destruction, not only does it almost always end up rebounding to their, I guess always, if we take the long view, ends up rebounding to their humiliation and defeat in the long run. But also it's usually they're not really, all they're doing is speeding it up. or making it more spectacular. So Numenor was already falling apart. Men were already potentially like corruptible. The elves had already, the Noldor had already started bickering amongst themselves. Even the Valar were starting to make bad calls. If you go with the idea that by wanting to get the Eldar into Valinor instead of letting them just roam around the world, they were being like a helicopter mom, too controlling, and they should have just trusted the process. So that means that in the mature version, Melkor is an unnecessary evil because he's no, which is just, on one level, is just a silly joke, but on the other, it's like he's no longer needed to achieve Eru's plan insofar as Eru's plan involves, people rebelling or things going wrong or there being like some sort of suffering to overcome. It's gonna happen eventually. It's just Melkor and then later Sauron and all of the rest of them come in and they're like, oh my gosh, I can make this be my thing. And then it turns out all they've done is just like sped it up and made it worse for themselves. They see an opportunity and it's like, I'm going to make this happen. It's like, well, that was already going to happen. Like, this was entirely superfluous.
Yeah, because you're right, because that's exactly what Eru he tells the Ainur and specifically Melkor, where they can't achieve anything that's out with what Eru's got planned anyway. It'll all be incorporated in some way, and it's a good way of putting it. It's if Melkor didn't do anything at these, or Sauron at these times where you're saying there was bickering and conflict amongst themselves, it would have played out not the exact same way, but there would have been challenges and change, which brings about new beginnings and everything like that. And they step in and they rush it in an unnatural way, but it's been incorporated into the plan anyway. It's the most, must be the most infuriating aspect of Melkor's, I'll say Melkor specifically, his whole existence, because Sauron by this time had convinced himself that Eru and the Valar had abandoned Middle Earth, and that was becomes the insincere atheist, as Tolkien says. But Melkor must have realized at some point it's like, no matter what I'm doing here, it's not really working out, and it's maybe Eru wasn't lying to me when he said that everything I tried to achieve is just going to get brought into the plan and a greater good's going to come from it. And I think I said it earlier, where the greater evil that Melkor places into the world, it seems that the counter to that is, well, a greater good will come at the end, because you can't start from a base level of good and get to some infinite good if nothing happens. You have to have your base start, and circumstance and change and conflict leads to potential growth. All the races grow in some way through the challenges that they face, and Arda as a whole does that. And it makes these, you said unnecessary evil, which was good, but it's almost like they're unnecessary in order for it to happen in maybe a shorter time or to an even greater extent. The fall of Numenor becomes, like you said, spectacular. It's a spectacular fall that's never going to be forgotten. But if it happened naturally, it could have just been a forgotten kingdom that was a rumor 5,000 years later. Like we think of, there'll be lost civilizations that we will never know of in our world, and Numenor may have been like that. But because it was such a catastrophic failure, men can grow from it and learn lessons from it, and Sauron had his hand in that, which was not what he intended. And so they're still necessary in a way, because those spectacular falls would lead to loftier heights, arguably. I think it's a good way of putting that. We should do a video and call it The Unnecessary Evil of Dark Lord.
Yes. We'll race and see
I'll
who
do
can
it
get it
first.
out first. Ready, go. No, just kidding. But yeah, exactly. In the sense that the harder they fight, specifically Melkor, like you said, because Sauron at this point has gotten pretty cynical with it all. Still prone to kind of falling into the same patterns of thought, but Melkor in particular, the harder he struggles thinking that this time, well, this can't possibly be what you intended. This has to be something that was not part of the plan. Look how crazy it is. I smashed Finway's head in with a hammer. Like, but there's two siblings that are like at each other's throats. People are dying. The Sands are dyed with blood, and it's like, how could this possibly be part of what you wanted? It's like, well, it wasn't, but it's really kind of cool. And I mean, it sounds really callous, but it's like, all it does is it just makes it more obvious. Everything that you do, if you do nothing, if Melkor does nothing, Eru still wins. The more Melkor does, the more he sees that it's, that it all redounds to enhancing the plan, and embellishing it even. And then I think that even extends to Melkor himself, where insofar as he starts to have an arc and the Valar become, I think, more capable of actual like growth as they become less the sort of mythologically inspired gods who it's like, well, is Ulmo and Ase like people, or are they just different ways that the ocean can act turned into like a character, given a voice, but they're really just forces of nature. As we get away from that, they actually do become kind of more like characters and have more like of a personality, rather than just as much as they start to become more bland, they also start to become more recognizable as characters. So Melkor gets opportunities, and I know we talked about this before, where he gets multiple opportunities to make a different choice, where if at any point he had been like, I'm gonna like, see where this, even if he just like, I'm just gonna see where this goes. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna say that this one has to be under my control or else not exist. I'm gonna just like let it exist. You get the feeling that he would have not become so pathetic. That's the term you've used a couple of times. Pathetic and pitiable, in the sense that he's hurting, he's losing his own dignity and getting farther and farther away from sanity, really. He's just becoming this self-deluded and ultimately pathetic, evil, but pathetic, pitiable creature who he's terrified, he's in pain, he's trapped, he there's nowhere he can go. And all, the only thing that he has to feel at all superior about is like, well, things are gonna sure suck for the rest of you. It's like, yeah, but we're gonna get, we'll get through it. It's fine. You haven't really done anything. You've just kind of made some things happen faster and some things happen slower. So if he had like calmed down a little bit on that, then it would still have gone according to plan, and he himself could have maybe like redounded to the greater glory a little bit. Maybe he could have actually been an interesting character at the end. Instead of getting progressively less interesting the more pitiable he gets, and the closer to non-entity he himself becomes.
Yeah, because that comes down to the idea of repentance, where there does reach a point where it's actually Eru that gives the blessing to the Valar deal with Melkor or Morgoth in the way that they do, and it's Christopher Tolkien writes that it's through the authority of Eru that they can actually banish him from creation. But these evil figures, it probably frustrates them as well, but no matter how great the evil they're creating or making is, they still have that chance to turn away from it. Like you're saying, it's any time before that final moment where the War of Wrath takes place, Melkor could have repented. It'd have to be genuine, obviously, but if he did go to Manwë and say, I've had enough, I've realised that it's a losing battle, and I've been wrong and everything. I don't think, and this is my opinion, but I don't think if he genuinely repented at that time, even after such horrors that he's contributed, like the creation of orcs and all this stuff, I don't think they would have said, okay, you're going to go to Mandos for 10 ages. I think the whole original Mandos punishment was for him to think on what he had done, and they were hoping that when it came out, he would have returned to good because they didn't really, Manwy didn't really understand what evil was. Now he really does. I don't think the punishment would be what would be on would be the first thing on their mind. It would be your repentance will be helping us attempt to fix what you've done. And I think even up to that last point, Morgoth had the chance to do that. We see that with all the figures. Sauron's got the chance to do that. Saruman gets given loads of chances to do it, and it just reaches a point where I don't want to say hopeless, but they've made it hopeless. They've chosen so many times not to do it, and there's only so many times you can offer. You have to be the ones that come forward, and they're not doing it. But that's showing us what makes these good figures good, that they would offer that chance through such extremes. And it was Morgoth who, almost by a point of his own pride, probably was saying, well, I'm in this far, why not just see it through to the end? And it's only when they're actually on his doorstep ripping the roof off that he's on his knees, and they know that's not genuine. That's a last attempt to deceive them, and they're way past that, and he gets executed. So I just think it's interesting that how long he had change, and it was even when this force had arrived that was clearly going to destroy his forces, he's still just have to just see it through. And he probably still thought when they were coming to get him that it'll be a slap in the wrist. They'll put me in prison for a while and then I'll be back out doing it again. And he was probably shocked that it was, oh no, you're actually getting your head cut off and banished from Arda. And I like to imagine what that would have been like, but it would have been quite interesting if we got some text about Morgoth's inner monologue about that, because that must have been quite a shock when it's like Manway's going to allow that to happen. He probably thought it would never be like that because he thought they were so pathetic with how often they would offer chances, and he had gone too far this time. But I think that's a really interesting part of the character. And I like what you said as well about he arguably becomes less interesting as a character the more that it's almost as if the more his essence of a character is placed into the world. Morgoth as an individual becomes less interesting, but his influence in the world is what becomes the character essentially, and so it's like that part becomes less interesting, but then that part becomes more interesting, and he's there for the rest of the story in some form. So I quite like that.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, instead of Morgoth, we get Karathras. Like these things in Middle Earth that have become more interesting and like problematic, but they cause problems. But they're more interesting in part because they're bits of Melkor's potentially original greatness. Karathras is like he's a nasty mountain, but there's something kind of awesome about him too. Like in the you're kind of a worthy foe.
Yeah.
So I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it again. But I mean, what if the last 2 hours been if not just us reading way too much into it? And I think, as far as internal monologue goes, I feel like it might be like Norman Bates at the end of Psycho. He's like, they would never execute me, a harmless old lady. Yes, surely this plan will work. I'm not even going to swat that fly.
It's funny that you say that, because that monologue at the end of Psycho almost ruins the character of Norman Bates, because you don't want to actually hear what he's thinking. So it's almost as if Tolkien had let us read what Morgoth was thinking. Could it be better than what we imagine he was thinking in that moment? It's one of these things that it's probably good that we weren't told, because we can just imagine the terror and shock of Morgoth, and it'd be probably better than what could be written, because there'd be a lot of pleading and like bargaining and denial and all this. It'd be going through stages of grief, and then it's quite good that we can just imagine it and not be told what a character's feeling. It's sometimes better just to imagine, I think.
Yeah, that's like that one of the things that happens a lot with Tolkien that I only started to appreciate after a few go rounds with him is that he does pay a lot of attention, I think, to things like character and psychology, but he leaves a lot unsaid. So it's very understated, and if you're not willing to look for it, you'll miss it. But a lot of the pathos is in things that seem like he's glossing over it, and it's like he's not. At least half the time, I'm pretty sure that he's not. What he's doing is he's deliberately being like, this is too big to communicate through description, so I'm just gonna like kind of vaguely outline it and then let you fill in what's happening. And like, oh my gosh, then it becomes very poignant through the brevity of it. But the brevity doesn't mean that he's skipping it or that he's saying it didn't happen. Like these emotional moments are. It's like when Feanor flips off the herald of or messenger of Manwë, who may be Mondos himself, and it doesn't literally flip him off, but I imagine there may have been some Quenya equivalent rude gestures. And basically says like, yeah, tell Manwë like we're gonna go finish the job he should have finished himself. And they report that back to Manwë, who of course knows like this is not going to end well for them. He knows, okay, we've chosen option C, the unfathomable pain for all of you option. All right, cool. And it just says like and Manwë wept, and then it's like on to the next one. It's like, dude, he's like the king of the world, and he's crying because he's like sad for these elves who are to him as little gnats. So it's like you can't say that the guy doesn't care, but he doesn't like
He's
we
not
don't
cursing them either. Yeah, he's not the one
yeah.
cursing them. He's crying because they've done it to themselves, and they're still getting a chance, even when they get the prophecy of the North. They're still being told when they're on their journey, you can still go back. But again, this is the chances thing. They've been given like, would that be the third chance? And it's even after the kinslaying, they'd have to face some sort of punishment for it, but they still could have went back. And they're doing it themselves, and they're getting so many chances, and if it's not working out, like you say, we don't need to hear what Manwë's getting told and then his words back. It's almost like the "and Morgoth came" part. It's a few words can be more powerful than a page of description. It's these parts are quite memorable for their brevity, as you said. They've become quite powerful. Tolkien does it that way, and that would be on purpose, obviously.
Yeah, I think he gets the power of letting people fill in the gaps themselves. That seems to be very much in line with what he's doing. All right, before I find something else interesting to talk about and send us down another rabbit hole. This has been excellent. I think there's a lot more, obviously. So I don't think we've had too much overlap, honestly, with the first time we talked about this. I think there's plenty more that we could still talk about. And as you said, we've kind of deliberately held off from getting too deep into Sauron. So that's a whole other topic that we're hoping we can tackle. But I think for now, we'll call that good for Morgoth for the moment. You never know. They might publish, a 2-page letter that says something about him in a couple years that we're all gonna have to pay $50 to get a hold of, and then we'll have to discuss it. But we'll call it good for Morgoth. Looking forward to seeing your Rings of Power series as that gets underway, God willing, and good luck with that. I know how that feels.
Yeah, I know.
And yeah, do you maybe want to tell people one more time where they can find you online, or where they should go looking if they want to see more of your thoughts on this and other fascinating topics?
Yep. So again, I'm Stephen from the Red Book. If you search for the Red Book on YouTube or youtube.com at the Red Book, you'll find my page. And I've organized all my videos into different series. So we've been talking a lot about Morgoth and Melkor today. I have a whole bunch of videos on him if you're wanting to go and check them out. And other figures like that, like Saruman, like Sauron, and the Legendarium as a whole. So check out the channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment if this video here is what actually led you over to my channel. That'd be cool to hear as well. So I've really enjoyed this, and I can't wait to start the not so secret Sauron discussion that we're going to have. But it won't take 3 years this time to do that. But
Hopefully.
guarantee that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
2.5. We'll get it down. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. Pleasure as always. Always find these very fun, and we've obviously not run out of things to say. We could probably have kept going, but I think for our own sanity, we'll have to call it. So,
Yep.
Thank you everyone for watching who has stuck with us for any length of time, and check out Stephen's channel. If you are so inclined, you could probably watch this and then watch like the video topics I come up with in the next 12 months, and half of them will probably have some reference to or their source in this conversation. So cool. And yeah, thank you so much, and everyone have a good time.
Bye.
Bye.